And from China's high net wealth, growing multimillionaire class, we're joined now by China analyst Sam Chester from Clarity Capital regarding China's growing upper middle class. Mr. Chester, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure, as always.
So, can you give me a little bit information here about, this growing middle class? Who are these people really?
Yeah, it's important to understand that China's middle class today wasn't China's middle class yesterday. The first thing to understand is that this is a new trend. These people don't come from families of middle class. Their parents were often poor. That said, the numbers, the growth rate is astounding. From 1995 until today, China's middle class, which is generally defined as within the income bracket of between 6,000 to about 34,000 household budgets.
Right.
China's middle class from 1995 until 2014 grew from close to zero, more or less, in the early 90s, to almost 250 million people in today's China. Right. So the numbers are huge, and they're emerging, and they're projected by 2022 in another few years to get to close to half of Chinese population. So China's on the way to becoming a middle-class nation, essentially.
It's really amazing. What is really behind? What underlies this growth rate?
The first thing is urbanization. China, a few years ago, about 2 decades ago, most people weren't living in cities. As more and more Chinese have moved to the East Coast, moved to the coastal developed areas, moved to the large cities, higher paying jobs have followed in their wake, and a middle class has emerged. And you see this again by the numbers. In 2000, not that many years ago, about 15 years ago, 30% of China's population was living in cities. Of those 30% of urbanized Chinese, 4% were middle class. Today, urbanized China, over 60% are middle class. So it's very much a product of the growing urbanization in China. That said, government policies have also helped. The Chinese government, Beijing... I was
just going to say, because really Beijing has been pushing, on the one hand, for people to actually move into the cities.
For sure. And the government has invested heavily in infrastructure. Just a few years ago when China rolled out its new rail project throughout China, there was a lot of criticism. People said it would never be used, and it's been the opposite. The train lines have been embraced by the consumer market. So it's the infrastructure, it's the healthcare. Today in China, over 95% of people have basic medical insurance thanks to the government. So the government has really made this a focus for reasons that we can hopefully get into as well.
Okay. This actually leads me to another question, which is infrastructure, construction. There's been tremendous construction in China. This is one of the ways in which China really grew in terms of the economy. But it's also one of the things that's kind of weighing on its growth in the long run, right?
The big challenge China's facing today, and the discussion, it's been facing this for the last few years, and the government is wrestling with how to overcome this challenge, is how to move from an export-led economy, which has been China's growth model for the last 3 decades, ever since the 1980s when China emerged as an economic superpower, to a domestic consumer-based economy. And the transformation from being based upon exporting your goods, producing goods for the world, and the world is buying them, to internally buying goods and actually buying goods from the world has tremendous implications, not only for China's economy, but for the global economy as well.
Tell me a little bit more about how this growing middle class sector is affecting the Chinese economy.
Well, again, Beijing, the Chinese government, is facing a threat in that their economy has to go from exporting to the world. And on the one hand, they're looking at global markets, which are basically reaching a peak where they can no longer buy any more Chinese goods. As a result, if the Chinese growth rate is to continue, it needs to find new markets for its production. Now, those new markets have to come from somewhere, and the best market for China, frankly, is its own domestic population. Chinese consumer class, which again is coming from the middle class that we're speaking of, is estimated to be a market value of 5 to 7 billion if fully tapped. If China's economy is to succeed and to maintain the growth rates, that frankly the government needs to stay in power. So there's a very huge political element to this, that it needs to develop more of a consumer class based upon its middle class community in China.
Yet at the same time, you could maybe say that one of the challenges here is that as people have more money, the consumers in China also are more sophisticated. They have a better understanding of what quality is, and they're obviously exposed to foreign products as well. How do you think this might play out in the long run in terms of having, this competition between Chinese goods and international goods?
So I like what you're saying, because there's both an economic and a political element here. On the economic economic side, the Chinese middle class, the growing consumer class, they're more and more aware of global goods. They seek quality brands, which often are global brands. And they're the force behind China's overseas travel. They're traveling abroad, they're buying foreign goods. And so you see, on the one hand, that trend. On the other hand, the political element is that traditionally a rising middle class and a rising consumer middle class leads to more pressure on the government to become more democratic, to have more of a rules-based society, more regulations, more open to the needs.
To what the growing middle class want, so to speak.
Of course. And the model was demonstrated in Europe, it was demonstrated in the Americas, it was demonstrated in South America and many other places. Middle class leads to a democratic society. In China, you're not seeing that, which is one of the most interesting things, in that China's developing a model where its emerging middle class is shifting towards a consumer-based economy, and yet political reform is lagging behind.
Okay, and at the same time, we have seen something similar happen in Singapore.
Yeah, East Asia has set a model. On the one hand, Singapore, as you mentioned, an authoritarian government, and yet South Korea did manage to shift from no political reform to more political openness. I think the very last point, which is very important here to focus, is what this means for foreign companies. Foreign companies see a Chinese consumer market that's going to rise, going to become a $7 billion market, and particularly for foreign financial companies, like, for instance, Clarity Capital, this presents a tremendous opportunity because they have a comparative advantage to provide their financial services to the growing Chinese middle-class market.
Okay, well, Sam Chester, China analyst from Clarity Capital, thanks so much for joining us and for giving us more information regarding the growing middle class in China.
It's a pleasure as always.
Thank you.